The wind moved across the open land like a living thing carrying dust heat and the low warning of a hard day ahead. In the wide emptiness of the old West, a lone cowboy rode slowly beneath a sky that felt too big for one man to face alone. His shoulders sagged not from age but from loss, and the lines on his face told stories no one had ever asked to hear. This was not a hero riding toward glory, but a survivor moving forward, because stopping meant dying in this wild western tale. The land itself watched him, knowing it had broken stronger men before. He had once owned a small stretch of earth where grass grew honest and water ran clear. He had once believed in tomorrow, then fire and steel took it all, leaving behind only ashes and silence. The frontier did not care for dreams, and neither did the men who came in the night. Now all he had left in the world was the horse beneath him, faithful, tired, and wounded, much like its rider. Every step echoed with the memory of better days, and every mile pulled him farther from the man he used to be. The horse stumbled, and the cowboy leaned forward, steadying it with a gentle hand. He whispered nothing, because words had lost their power long ago. Around him stretched a desert that seemed endless, broken only by distant hills and scattered rock. The sun climbed higher, pressing down with cruel weight, and the smell of blood drifted faintly on the air. He did not know it yet, but fate was already moving toward him, silent and unstoppable. He heard the sound before he saw her, a weak breath, a scrape against stone, hidden among scrub and shadow. Drawing his revolver, he moved carefully, every sense alert, expecting an ambush or worse. What he found instead stopped his heart. A woman lay against the rocks, her dark hair tangled with dirt, her clothing torn and stained red. An Apache woman, wounded badly, left behind after violence had passed. Her eyes opened just enough to see him, and in them was no fear, only exhaustion and pain. The Old West was ruled by rules written in blood. A white cowboy helping an Apache woman was not mercy, but a death sentence. He knew this as clearly as he knew his own name. His hand tightened on the revolver, then slowly relaxed. He knelt beside her and saw the truth: she would not last the day without help. His horse shifted behind him, breathing hard, as if aware of the choice about to be made. The land went quiet, as though waiting. Memories flooded him, memories of turning away, of surviving when others did not, of choosing himself again and again. He looked at the horse, his last possession, his last chance at staying alive. Giving it up would mean walking alone through a land that showed no forgiveness, yet leaving her would mean carrying another ghost inside him for the rest of his days. The wind whispered through dry grass, and the choice became clear, not easy, but clear. He lifted her with care, every movement costing him strength, and placed her gently on the horse. He tied her in place with his own bedroll, gave her his last water, and pressed the reins into her shaking hand. The horse looked back, once dark eyes full of question, then moved forward, carrying her away toward distant hills and uncertain hope. The cowboy stood watching until they vanished, swallowed by heat and dust. Then he turned and began to walk. Each step burned, his boots filled with sand, his throat dried, and the sun punished him without mercy. Night came slow and cold, bringing sounds of wolves and distant riders. He kept moving, driven by something deeper than survival. Perhaps this was what redemption felt like: painful, uncertain, and earned mile by mile. In this wild old Western story, the hero was not born in a gunfight, but in a moment of quiet sacrifice. By morning, his vision blurred and his strength faded. Shadows danced along the rocks, and he collapsed, believing the land had finally claimed him. Yet fate was not finished. The story was only arriving at its beginning, because the woman he saved was not just another wounded soul. She carried a past bound to power, loss, and promise, and her people would not forget the man who chose compassion over fear. Far away, she woke among her own, surrounded by familiar voices and healing hands. When she learned what he had given, she spoke his description aloud, and the camp fell silent. Among the Apache, a debt of life was sacred, and such a debt could not go unanswered. Riders were sent, tracks followed, and the desert that once threatened him now guided them straight to his fallen form. As the sun rose again over the frontier, two paths crossed once more. The cowboy awoke surrounded by strangers, yet he did not reach for a weapon. He saw her standing there, alive, steady, and watching him with eyes filled not with weakness but resolve. In that moment his fate shifted, though he could not yet see how. The wild Western tale had only just begun, and the land leaned closer, ready to witness what one act of mercy would unleash. The cowboy drifted in and out of waking as heat gave way to shade, and unfamiliar voices wrapped around him like a distant river. He smelled smoke, herbs, and leather, and felt hands that worked with care rather than cruelty. When his eyes finally opened fully, he did not see rope or rifles aimed at his chest. Instead, he saw faces watching him closely, men and women marked by travel, struggle, and quiet strength. The Apache camp rested in a bowl of stone and earth, hidden from the open plains and guarded by silence rather than walls. He did not move at first, knowing sudden motion could end him faster than any bullet. The woman stood near the fire, wrapped in a blanket. Her wound bound clean and tight, she looked stronger now, no longer fading into the dust. She met his gaze without hatred or gratitude, only recognition, as if seeing a man she had already known in another life. Around them the camp went on. Children moved, elders spoke low, and warriors kept watch on the ridges with eyes sharp as hawks. An older man stepped forward, his hair silver, his presence heavy with authority. He spoke in a calm, measured voice that carried across the camp, even to the listening hills. The woman answered him and then turned back to the cowboy, explaining through slow, careful words that he had been brought here because of her, because he had given up his horse, knowing it might cost his life. Among her people, such an act could not be ignored. Life answered life, and mercy answered mercy. The cowboy listened, his throat tight, unsure whether this was salvation or another path toward death. He told them nothing of his past because the past felt small compared to what lay ahead. He only said he had done what any man should do when faced with another dying soul. Some of the warriors shifted at that, others nodded as if they understood that kind of truth. The old man studied him for a long moment, then gave a slow, deliberate nod. Days passed and strength returned slowly to the cowboy. His wounds were cleaned, his thirst eased, and food shared, though always watched. The camp remained wary, but no longer hostile. He learned the woman was the daughter of a respected leader taken for dead after a brutal clash. Her survival had already shifted the balance of power among nearby tribes and soldiers alike. Her return was not a small thing, and neither was the man who made it possible. At night, the cowboy sat by the fire, listening to stories told in a language older than fences and railroad, stories of land that remembered every footstep and of spirits that followed those who carried heavy choices. The wind moved through the camp, carrying sparks upward like lost stars. And for the first time in years, the cowboy slept without dreaming of flames or gunfire. But peace in the Old West never lingered long. Scouts returned with grim news. Soldiers were moving closer, their patrols tighter, their intentions sharp. The Apache knew this land, but the army brought numbers and hunger for control. The woman spoke with her people, urging caution, urging movement, urging survival. The old man listened, then turned to the cowboy, asking a question that carried weight far beyond words. Would he leave, or would he stand with them? The cowboy felt the question settle into his bones. He had spent his life moving on, surviving by not choosing sides, but the desert had taken his horse, his past, and nearly his life, and in return had given him something unexpected, a chance to stand for something that mattered. He asked for time and walked to the edge of the camp, where the land opened wide before him. The same land that had nearly killed him now looked different, less empty, more alive. Before he could answer, the sound of distant hooves rolled across the plain. Not a patrol, not yet, but close enough to set nerves on edge. The camp moved quickly, quietly, like a storm gathering beneath calm skies. The woman joined him on the ridge and told him that his horse had returned on its own days. Earlier, guided by instinct or something deeper, the animal stood nearby, healed and strong, as if waiting for him. She placed the reins in his hands, not as a gift, but as a choice. He understood then that whatever path he took would echo beyond him. If he rode away, the Apache would remember him with honor. If he stayed, his fate would be bound to theirs. The old Western world rarely allowed such moments, and when it did, they demanded everything. He stayed. As night settled, the woman stood beside the cowboy once more and told him that his debt had been answered, but his path was still his own. Beyond the hills lay a chance at land granted through fragile agreements and broken promises, a place where a man might start again if he carried the weight of his choices with honesty. She told him the land would remember him now, not as a drifter but as someone who stood when it mattered. When dawn came, the camp moved on, leaving behind only tracks and quiet. The cowboy mounted his horse, feeling the old ache of loss and the new ache of purpose. The frontier stretched before him, unchanged, yet utterly different. He rode not away from something, but toward a future shaped by sacrifice and survival. In this wild old Western story, fate did not come with fanfare. It came with dust, wind, and the courage to choose compassion when the world expected cruelty. The cowboy rode west with the sun at his back, and the memory of the Apache camp still breathing in his thoughts. The land opened before him in long stretches of dust and grass broken by stone and shadow. He felt different now, not lighter, but steadier, as if the weight he carried had finally found its place. The horse moved with confidence, each step strong and sure, and the bond between them felt renewed, as though both understood they had survived something meant to break them. By the third day he reached the edge of settled territory, where fences leaned and buildings stood tired from too many hard seasons. The town appeared slowly rising from the plain like a scar that never healed right. Wooden structures pressed close together for comfort, and the air smelled of sweat, smoke, and old fear. This was the kind of place that remembered gunfire longer than kindness, and the cowboy felt every eye follow him as he rode in. He dismounted near the hitching rail, and the sound of his boots on dirt drew attention. Conversations fell quiet, and hands drifted closer to belts. He was not a stranger to towns like this. He had been judged here before, measured by scars and posture and the way he carried himself. Trouble did not need an invitation, it only needed silence and too much history. Inside the saloon, the light was dim and heavy with smoke. A piano played soft and tired, as if even music had grown weary of hope. The bartender looked up and froze for a moment, recognition flickering across his face. The cowboy had not been here in years, but memory traveled faster than men. Ever since the fire and the night his land burned, his name had followed him like a shadow. Whispers moved through the room. Some spoke of betrayal, others of survival. No one spoke of truth, because truth rarely fit inside one story. The cowboy took a seat near the wall, keeping his back clear and his hands visible. He ordered water because he had learned the cost of thirst, and waited. The sheriff entered not long after, boots echoing with authority, earned more by reputation than law. He was older now, heavier, slower, but his eyes still carried sharp intent. He studied the cowboy for a long moment, then approached, lowering his voice so only they could hear. He spoke of patrols, of rising tension, of pressure from the army to push harder against anyone seen as a threat. The frontier was tightening, and men like the cowboy were caught between sides, whether they chose to be or not. The sheriff warned him that helping the Apache even once marked a man forever. In these times, mercy was mistaken for treason, and survival required clean lines drawn deep and final. The cowboy listened without interrupting, because he knew the sheriff was not wrong, only incomplete. He answered that the land did not care for lines drawn by men, and neither did fate. That night the town did not sleep. Riders came late, their horses' lathered eyes wild. They brought news that spread like fire. Soldiers had returned to the region, angry, embarrassed, and hunting for someone to blame. They would pass through by morning, and they would ask questions that demanded answers written in blood. The cowboy knew then that leaving again would only delay what was coming. This land remembered names, and his had already been spoken. He left the saloon and walked the quiet streets, listening to the wind slide between buildings. The stars above were sharp and bright, uncaring witnesses to the choices of men. He thought of the Apache woman, her calm strength, her belief that actions echoed farther than bullets. He thought of the old man and the camp already moving beyond reach, adapting as they always had. The army would not find them easily, but the town would not be so lucky. At dawn, the soldiers arrived in dust and formation boots, hitting the ground with practiced certainty. Their leader rode at the front, posture stiff, eyes cold. He wasted no time questioning the sheriff, demanding information about Apache movement and anyone seen aiding them. The town held its breath, and the cowboy stepped forward before fear could speak louder than truth. He said only that he had crossed paths with the Apache days earlier, and that they had moved on as they always did. He did not lie, but he did not offer more. The officer studied him, taking in the worn coat, the steady gaze, the absence of apology. He recognized something there. Something dangerous, not rebellion, but conviction. The officer ordered his men to search the town anyway. They overturned crates, frightened families, and dragged men into the street demanding loyalty sworn aloud. The cowboy watched, fists clenched, knowing violence would bring more violence, but silence had its own cost. When a young boy was shoved to the ground for standing too close, something inside him broke loose. Like a storm finally given room. He stepped between the soldier and the child, voice low but firm. He said the boy had nothing to give them and that this town had already paid enough. The officer laughed, a short, sharp sound, and raised his pistol, not to shoot, but to remind everyone who held power in that moment. The land seemed to hold its breath again. The sound of hooves thundered in the distance, not one or two, but many. The soldiers turned, startled hands moving fast. The riders came hard and fast. From the hills, not attacking, but surrounding, cutting off retreat. Their faces were hidden by dust and distance. But their presence was unmistakable. The Apache had returned not for war, but for balance. The woman rode at the front, her posture unyielding. She raised a hand, and the riders stopped, dust settling around them like a curtain drawn aside. She spoke not with anger, but authority, telling the officer that the land he stood on was older than his orders, and that blood spilled here would only poison what little peace remained. The officer hesitated, trapped between pride and reason, between command and consequence. The cowboy stood beside her, not as a savior, but as witness proof that choices carried weight beyond borders. After a long silence, the officer ordered his men to stand down. He knew when a fight could not be won without losing something greater than victory. The soldiers withdrew. Slowly, eyes burning but restrained, the town exhaled as one. When the dust cleared, the woman turned to the cowboy and nodded. Once there were no words left to say, the Apache riders melted back into the land, leaving behind a silence filled with meaning. The sheriff approached, removing his hat, his voice unsteady, as he thanked a man he had once doubted. As the sun climbed, the cowboy knew he could not stay. This town would never forget, and neither would those who watched from the hills. He mounted his horse once more and rode toward the open land where fences thinned and possibility widened. The wild western tale pressed forward, carried by wind memory, and a land that remembered names and honored those who chose mercy when the world demanded cruelty. The cowboy rode until the town disappeared behind dust and distance, yet the weight of what had happened traveled with him. The land rolled, wide and empty, but his thoughts were loud with memory. He had stood between power and fear, and the land had answered in ways he did not expect. In the wild old western stories, this was often the moment when a man believed the storm had passed, but the frontier never settled debts so easily. By the second night he reached a stretch of land marked by old survey posts, half buried and leaning like tired sentinels. This place had once been promised to men who believed paper could tame soil. He remembered this ground because it was near where his ranch once stood. The fire had erased buildings, fences, and dreams, yet the earth remained patient, holding scars like secrets waiting. He dismounted and let the horse drink from a narrow creek. The sound of water carried comfort and warning in equal measure. He sensed movement long before he saw it. Riders approached slowly from the far ridge, not soldiers, not Apache. Their silhouettes told a different story. Wide hats, careless posture, guns worn but ready. Men who lived between law and war, feeding off both. They did not rush him. They circled the clearing like wolves, testing wind and weakness. Their leader rode forward, a grin cutting through his beard, eyes sharp with recognition. This man had ridden with gangs that burned farms and vanished before dawn. The same kind that had taken everything from the cowboy years ago. Fate had a cruel way of tightening circles. The leader spoke casually, calling him by name as if time had never passed. He said he had heard stories of a man standing with the Apache of a town spared blood because of one stubborn soul. He laughed, saying the frontier was changing and men like them needed to decide where they stood before others decided for them. He offered protection, a place among those who took rather than lost. The cowboy felt old anger rise, slow and dangerous. He remembered the smell of smoke, the sound of wood collapsing, the silence that followed. He told the man he was done running with shadows and done pretending survival was the same as living. The leader shrugged, saying choices had prices, and rode back to his men, leaving a warning hanging heavy in the air. That night the cowboy did not sleep. He built a small fire and watched sparks drift upward, thinking of the Apache woman, her calm strength, her certainty that acts echoed beyond moments. He wondered if she felt the coming tension too, if the land whispered the same warnings to her people as it did to him. The horse shifted uneasily, sensing danger carried on the wind. At dawn, the attack came swift and brutal. Shots cracked through the still air, and the clearing erupted into chaos. The cowboy moved on instinct, diving for cover, returning fire with precision born of hard years. He fought not for land or pride, but for the right to stand where he chose. The bandits pressed hard, using numbers and hunger for control. He was wounded early, a grazing shot tearing his shoulder, but he stayed upright, pain sharpening focus. He used the terrain, rocks, trees, and the shallow creek, turning familiarity into advantage. Hours seemed to pass in moments, and moments stretched long enough to hold fear and resolve side by side. When the smoke cleared, several attackers lay still, and the rest withdrew, cursing, promising return. The cowboy sank to his knees, breath ragged, blood soaking his sleeve. The land around him fell silent again, but this time it felt heavy, as if waiting for the next move. He knew then that staying alone was no longer an option. The frontier had marked him openly, and predators had taken notice. He needed ground that could be defended, and a reason strong enough to hold it. He rode west toward a high plain where grass grew thick and water ran steady, a place spoken of in quiet hopes and broken plans. A parcel of land tied to old treaties, half honored and half forgotten. The same land the Apache had mentioned, the place where uneasy agreements allowed a man to settle if he was willing to bear the cost. By the time he arrived, the wound had worsened and fever crept close. He collapsed near a stand of cottonwoods, vision swimming. The sound of hooves came again, and this time he did not reach for his gun. He trusted the land to finish what it had begun. When he woke, he was under shade, his shoulder cleaned and bound with practiced care. The Apache woman sat nearby, grinding herbs, her face calm, but her eyes filled with understanding. She said little, only that the land had chosen him again, and that choices once made could not be unmade. The Apache camp was not far hidden, but watching, always watching. Days passed as he healed, strength returning slower this time. Each morning he helped where he could, repairing tools, gathering wood, learning the rhythms of a people who moved with seasons. Rather than commands, he did not belong, yet he was no longer an outsider in the old Western world. Such a place was rare and fragile. News arrived, carried by scouts. The bandits were gathering again, planning to strike the town that had defied them and the land the cowboy now occupied. They wanted control, wanted fear to return where it had slipped away. The Apache knew this kind of threat well. They spoke of defense, not revenge, of standing firm without losing who they were. The cowboy listened, knowing this was the moment the frontier demanded payment for all the mercy shown. He offered what he knew, strategies, choke points, and the hard truth that fear could only be answered by unity. The Apache woman agreed, and for the first time she spoke of the future not as survival but as possibility. They prepared quietly, reinforcing positions, setting signals, trusting the land to hide them as it always had. The cowboy stood on the rise at dusk, watching shadows stretch long across grass and stone. He felt the weight of every step that had led him here, from loss to sacrifice, from solitude to responsibility. As night fell, torches flared in the distance. The bandits were coming louder and bolder than before. The land seemed to lean inward, holding breath again. The cowboy checked his rifle steady, despite the ache in his shoulder. He knew this fight would decide more than territory. It would decide whether mercy could hold ground in a world built on taking. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of dust, sweat, and old violence. The Apache warriors moved into position, silent, as thought. The woman stood beside the cowboy, her presence firm and unyielding. She did not speak, but her hand rested briefly on his arm, grounding him, reminding him that whatever came next would be faced together. In this wild western tale, the frontier closed its circle once more, not with promises or prophecy, but with men, women, land, and choice bound tight beneath a darkening sky, ready to test whether sacrifice could truly change fate. The night thickened around the high plain, and the sky pressed low, as if the stars themselves wanted to witness what was coming. The cowboy stood still, listening to the sounds that mattered, the shift of boots in grass, the breath of horses, the quiet signals. Passed hand to hand among the Apache, there was no panic, only readiness, shaped by generations who understood that survival was not luck but preparation. The bandits came without caution, riding hard and loud, believing fear would break resistance before bullets ever flew. Their torches cut jagged paths through the dark, and their voices carried arrogance born from too many towns that folded when threatened. The cowboy recognized the sound of false confidence, the kind that cracked the moment resistance answered back. When the first shots rang out, they came not from the open but from shadow. The land itself seemed to strike as riders fell and horses screamed confusion, ripping through their charge. The Apache moved as one, striking and vanishing, drawing the enemy inward away from their strength and into the teeth of terrain that favored those who listened to it. The cowboy fired with calm precision, every shot measured, not wasted. He remembered every lesson learned in loss and survival, using elevation, distance, and timing. He was not fighting for revenge, he was fighting so this place would not become another scar burned into memory. The bandit leader shouted orders, trying to regain control, but chaos had already taken hold. Torches fell, darkness swallowed their lines, and fear crept in. The Apache war cries rose, not wild but purposeful, shaking the resolve of men who had never faced resistance that did not break. A rider charged the cowboy, head on gun raised and reckless. The cowboy stepped aside, letting momentum become weakness, and struck hard, sending the man tumbling into the dirt. He did not linger, he moved because stillness in battle meant death. The fight stretched on the night, pulled tight by sound and motion. Dust filled the air, mixing with smoke and the sharp scent of blood. The land echoed every footstep, every breath, as if remembering each choice being made upon it. Somewhere nearby, the Apache woman directed movement, her voice calm, cutting through noise with authority. She was not behind the fight, nor ahead of it, she was within it, shaping it. As the hours wore on, the bandits realized too late they were not fighting a scattered camp, but a united front bound by purpose. Some tried to flee only to find their paths closed. Others dropped weapons and begged mercy, discovering that mercy did not mean weakness but restraint. By the time the first light crept over the horizon, the ground was littered with broken resolve. The bandits were gone, scattered, or captured. Their hold on fear finally shattered. The silence that followed was heavy but different from before. Not waiting, not threatening, settled. The Apache gathered their wounded and honored their fallen with quiet respect. The cowboy moved among them, helping where he could, his shoulder burning, but his spirit steady. He had survived again, but this time survival felt shared rather than stolen. As the sun rose fully, the land revealed itself, green in places, scarred in others, yet standing the high plain held its breath. No longer it had chosen sides, not through words but through outcome. The Apache woman approached the cowboy, her face marked by exhaustion and pride. She told him that this victory would echo far beyond this place. Bandits would think twice, towns would remember, soldiers would reconsider. But victory carried cost. She said the army would come eventually, not in anger, but in calculation. Agreements would be tested, lines redrawn, yet something had changed. A story had begun to travel, one that spoke of unity rather than conquest, of mercy defended rather than exploited. The cowboy looked out across the land and understood that this was the interval between storms, the moment where fate paused to see what men would do with the ground they had won. He knew he could not simply fade into the horizon again. The frontier would not allow it, not after he had stood this openly. The Apache woman told him of a meeting to come, elders, leaders, and representatives of the new order, a chance, however fragile, to secure this land under terms that acknowledged those who bled for it. She said his presence would matter, not as an owner but as a bridge. He felt the weight of that responsibility settle onto him, heavier than any rifle. He had been a man with nothing, now he was a man carrying something worth protecting. The irony did not escape him. That evening, as fires were lit and food shared, the mood shifted from vigilance to reflection. Stories were told not loudly but with care, marking names, moments, and choices. The cowboy shared little but listened much, learning how deeply this land was woven into identity and how easily it could be lost when voices were ignored. As stars returned to the sky, the Apache woman sat beside him and spoke of paths forward, of coexistence that did not erase difference. She did not promise peace, only possibility. She asked him not for loyalty but for honesty, the kind that stood even when standing became dangerous. He agreed, knowing that the hardest battles often followed victory, not preceded it. The frontier tested resolve long after gunfire faded. In the quiet hours before sleep, he looked across the high plain once more. The wind moved gently, now carrying no warning, only distance. In this wild western tale, the land had witnessed fire, blood, and courage, and for the first time it felt as though the ground beneath his feet was not borrowed but earned. Morning arrived without ceremony, the kind that belonged to land older than promises. The high plain stretched wide, carrying the quiet strength of something that had endured countless endings and beginnings. The cowboy rose before the others, his body aching, but his spirit clear. He knew this was not an ending shaped by fire alone, but by what followed after the smoke lifted. The gathering came at midday, riders arriving from distant edges of the frontier. Some wore uniforms, others wore coats frayed by travel, and whether elders from the Apache stood firm, their presence calm and unyielding. The air carried tension but also restraint, the rare kind born from shared memory of loss. The cowboy stood among them, not at the center, but not hidden either. Words were exchanged carefully, each carried weight heavier than bullets. The land was spoken of not as property, but as responsibility. The Apache spoke of history of paths older than maps. The representatives spoke of borders, treaties, and the hunger of a growing nation. The cowboy listened, then spoke when silence asked for truth. He spoke of sacrifice given freely, of mercy returned with courage, of a place defended not by ownership but by unity. His voice did not rise, yet it carried across the gathering. He told them this land had already chosen its people, and that any future written here would need to honor those choices. He did not ask for favor. He offered witness proof that cooperation was not weakness, but strength hard won. The discussion stretched, long shadows shifting as the sun crossed the sky. At last, an agreement took shape, fragile but real. A shared stewardship, a recognition of Apache claim, and a grant for the cowboy to settle not as master but as guardian. A place where fences would be light and trust would be heavier than paper. It was not justice fully, but it was a beginning. When the gathering ended, some rode away dissatisfied, others thoughtful. The Apache elders remained watching the land breathe beneath open sky. The woman approached the cowboy, her expression steady. She said the path ahead would not be easy, that doubt would return and pressure would follow. She asked him if he was ready to stay when staying meant standing again and again. He answered without hesitation. He said he had already walked through fire and emptiness, and that this place had given him reason to stand. His answer needed no embellishment, it was enough. Days turned into weeks. The cowboy built not a grand house, but a solid one, wood and stone, shaped by hand and patience. The Apache camp moved with seasons nearby, their presence constant but never imposing. Children passed through, laughter replacing echoes of gunfire. The land responded, grass grew thicker, water clearer. The frontier softened, not tamed but respected. Travelers began to speak of the place where bloodshed had stopped, where a lone cowboy and an Apache woman had shifted the course of things through choice rather than force. Some stories grew larger than truth, but the heart remained the story of sacrifice and return, of mercy defended by courage. The woman visited, often not as a guest but as a leader, checking balance, ensuring promises held. They spoke of weather and supply, of concerns that came with peace. The bond between them was not shaped by romance but by respect, deeper and rarer. They stood together when disputes arose and faced them with the same calm that had carried them through war. One evening, as the sun dipped low, the cowboy walked the edge of his land, watching light spill across grass and stone. He thought of the man he had been drifting through loss and anger, carrying nothing but survival. That man felt distant now, not erased, but transformed. The land remembered him differently, and so did he. In the distance he saw riders moving, not in threat but routine. The frontier still breathed danger, but it no longer owned him. He had earned his place not through conquest but through standing when it mattered most. As night settled, the stars returned bright and countless. The cowboy sat by a small fire, listening to the wind carry familiar sounds, voices from the Apache camp, laughter from the plain, the steady breath of his horse nearby. The land no longer felt empty, it felt alive, shared and held. In this wild western tale, fate was not rewritten by prophecy or power, but by a single choice made in the dust. A horse given a life, saved, a path changed forever. The frontier would continue to test those who lived upon it, but it would also remember the day compassion stood its ground and did not move. The cowboy looked up at the open sky, knowing his journey had not ended, but had finally begun where it was meant to be.